Okay. Yeah, so like Tom said, the final exam in class is going to be next week from 11 to 1. So the in-class people will have 2 hours. I believe we get online open with the 2 hours. But it's the same amount of questions that have been on your other exams, so I don't expect you to those, but it's there if you need it. So the format of the exam is very same as what you do. Multiple choice, short answer, fill in the blank, true, false. And so then for those of you that already saw the announcement, like I'll just go back over that if someone didn't. So it's going to be 75% of the old material. So just use your old exams as a good study guide, hint, hint, in case you didn't catch that in my announcement. And then 25% from these last 3 lectures. So not too much material in this last section because we missed a couple class periods. So we had a little bit less material than I thought we would at the end. So any questions on the exam format or anything? All good. So for online students, it's going to open tomorrow. And I have it set to open at 7 a.m. and then it will be open until the end of the day on next Wednesday. And so if your proctor information or anything has changed, please let me know because I'm going to be emailing the proctors the password today so that they have that. So everything should be ready to go for the online students. Also for the assignment, the issues and animal science assignment, that is due by tonight. So if you have not done that, go ahead and finish that so that you don't get points off for being late. So those are all of the announcements I have. Does anyone have any questions before we get started on today's review? Nope, all good? Okay. So today's review is going to be pretty quick because we only have the 3 lectures that we did in this section to go through. So I'll just kind of go through and review for kind of things that I think are important that I'd like you to know for the exam. So the first lecture that we covered in this section was animal behavior and animal welfare in the environment, and that was chapter 19. So just a kind of overall concept, livestock and companion animals exhibit complex behaviors related to different things. So reproduction, the care of their offspring, and then of course in response to external stresses. So kind of be familiar with that overall concept. And then they can exhibit physiological responses and behavioral responses to external stresses. So we talked about temperature stress, that can be a stressor for animals if the temperature is too high or too low. And then we talked about the 2 types of aggression. And so these words are fairly similar to each other, so it's very easy to get confused. So pay attention to this slide, and I would like you to know the difference between the 2 types of aggression. So interspecies is behavior between different species. So like when a predator attacks its prey, or anti-predatory behavior. So if animals are kind of going after a predator to protect themselves, that's also interspecies. So 2 different species. So intraspecies with the A is directed towards other members of the same species. So same has an A, intra has an A. I don't know if that's helping you. I do those weird little associations. And then different species has an E. So I don't know if that helps you at all. So some examples of interspecies aggression would be territoriality, protecting their territory, social hierarchy, and then other aggressive behaviors. So make sure that you're familiar with this slide and know the difference between these. They might have questions on that. So we've talked about the types of intra-species, so same species aggression. So territoriality is when an animal is defending their territory against an intruder, and then a couple examples there. So I want you to be familiar with the specific types of intraspecies aggression that we talked about. So territoriality and then social hierarchy. We spent a good amount talking about social hierarchy. So that's the peck order. And so that's really important, especially in social species and group house livestock. And that's important in order to maintain stability and reduce the chance that there's going to be an injury to the group. So make sure that you understand why that's important and what that is. So we also went over the link between testosterone and aggression. So testosterone is the male hormone that we talked about during the repro lecture. And so the presence of that male hormone, testosterone, acting on the brain can actually affect aggressive behaviors. So it's really important to realize that. So that could be why an animal that's maybe a dog that hasn't been fixed might be a little bit more aggressive than one that has been, because it's going to have more testosterone kind of circulating, and it is linked to aggression. So definitely understand that testosterone is the male hormone that acts on the brain and can affect aggressive behavior. So other examples of interspecies aggression, we talked about chickens kind of pecking each other, so that goes back to why social hierarchy is important. Dogs will show territoriality. So there are a lot of things that animals do to reproduce. There are a lot of reproductive behaviors. And so these are really important for a number of reasons. So to increase the chance that the male will be able to pass on its genes to as many offspring as they can. Increase the chance that the female gametes are going to be fertilized, restrict mating within the species. Other reproductive behavior is identifying when the female is fertile, so that needs to happen in order for mating to be successful. Courtship behaviors prior to mating, reproductive behavior, and then mounting, intermission, and insemination, and then parental behaviors to feed and protect the offspring. So go over this slide and be familiar with these behaviors that are kind of associated with reproductive behavior. Because if animals don't reproduce, then you're not going to get more animals. So it's really, really important to understand this slide. Then, of course, there are other animal behaviors like grooming, feeding, drinking, and things like that. So we talked about how temperature can be a stress. So things that animals will do to kind of cool themselves off or warm themselves up. So just kind of be familiar with that. How animals communicate is extremely important because they need to be able to communicate in their environment what's going on, and that leads to, or that kind of plays into a lot of how their behavior is displayed. So this slide, we talked about the different forms of communication between animals. So there's auditory detection, so hearing. They can hear other animals that are making noises or vocalizing. So for example, that could be a response to a mating call. Olfactory detection, so smelling. So we talked about pheromones and other scents. So that can be important for marking territory or the response of bulls to a cow in heat. Visual detection of signaling movements, so animals can see each other, right? So they can read another animal's behavior by looking at it. And then various tactile interactions, so touching, particularly between the offspring and the parent, to kind of facilitate that bond. So be familiar with this slide as well and the different types of communication that animals will use to kind of work with each other and reproduce and things like that. So stress, we've kind of talked about in several lectures and other sections as well. So stress is a really big deal because if your animal is getting stressed out, they're not going to grow as well, and their meat quality may not be as good as you would like. So there are a lot of different responses to stress, and so the classic response to an increase in stress is a large release of what hormone? I know it's on the slide, but what hormone? It was an extra credit question on your last test.
Cortisol.
Cortisol, right. So be familiar with that hormone because it was already on your test extra credit as an extra credit question. And so that is something that typically in animal studies you can measure as a good indicator of how stressed out that animal is. And so cortisol has a lot of different effects that can be negative on growth. So it's important to understand that stress can cause the release of that hormone. So there are two main types of stress that we talked about, physical stress and physiologic stress. So I would like you to know these two types and just be able to maybe give me like one example of each type of stress. So for example, physical stress, it would be like extreme intensity, so too hot or too cold. And a physiologic stress, something that would trigger a physiological response, would be like transportation, moving them to a new environment, being handled in any way, dehorning, and tail docking, and things like that. So definitely familiarize yourself with this slide and kind of know an example of each of these two types of stress. So there are different ways to assess stress. Again, I'm going to kind of point you to, you can measure levels of the stress hormone cortisol that's released. Temperament, of course, can be evaluated in domestic animals. In cattle, we talked about running them through a chute and scoring them as quiet and calm. And again, growth impairing effects of cortisol would be less pronounced in calm cattle. So that stress hormone cortisol is really important. So domestic animals are homeotherms, and so they want to maintain their body temperature. So there are a lot of different things that they can do to maintain this. So, for example, at temperatures that are above their thermal neutral zone, the animal has to lose heat because their bodies can't get too hot. So there are a couple of different things that they can do to lose heat. So there's increasing evaporative heat loss, increased blood flow to the skin, and behavioral responses, so like wallowing in ponds, or you might see pigs wallowing in the mud. And so these are really important. So if you see your animal kind of like wallowing around in mud and ponds, they may be hot, maybe make sure that there's enough shade in their pasture if they're outside, and things like that. Sometimes you can't really control the weather or the temperature, obviously, but just do what you can to make sure they have adequate shade or adequate kind of housing in the winter. So on this slide, be familiar with things that they can do to kind of cool themselves and how heat can be lost when that temperature is above their thermoneutral zone. So of course, extremely low temperatures can lead to reduced performance. So again, like I said, you want to make sure that animals have access to housing if possible. If they're in a pasture, have some sort of structure that can maybe kind of break up the wind in the pasture, or trees and things like that can do that. So basically, animals just really want to maintain their temperature within their thermoneutral zone. Does anyone have any questions about that presentation? Am I kind of going through it too fast, or do I need to slow down? Everybody's good? So the next chapter that we covered was chapter 20, where we talked about animal diseases. So, of course, we talked about zoonotic diseases. So that's an infectious animal disease that can cross species barriers and cause serious diseases in people. And so when you're talking about animal science, it is important to acknowledge that diseases can be spread from people to animals. So if you're going to be around animals, that's something to be aware of. So obviously that's bolded and underlined, which is my thing. So be familiar with that definition and what a zoonotic disease is. Because that's really, really important to understand when you're going to be around animals. So diseases obviously are something that's really important to deal with because they can reduce the productivity of the livestock, because the animals will either be too sick, they won't be growing very well, or you're going to have animals that may die depending on how severe the disease is. So it's really important to understand about animal diseases and how to prevent them. So there are a lot of different mechanisms that can be used to combat animal diseases, like good management, good sanitation practices, implementing biosecurity, vet care, obviously, monitoring and depopulation in the event of an outbreak. You may have to depopulate a farm if you can't get it contained. Vaccines, prophylactic drugs, and therapeutic drugs. So be familiar with those. I'm not going to ask you to list all of them, but be able to give me one or two mechanisms that are used to combat animal diseases. just because it is a really, really important thing. So you need to kind of have an idea of how diseases can be controlled. So on this slide, we talked about the definitions, and so I'm not going to get too much detail into things. So I'm trying to kind of stay fairly general because this is intro. So be familiar with these general definitions on this slide. So epidemiology is the science of the spread and control of disease. And then we talked about the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. So an epidemic is an infectious disease that spreads rapidly, causing many people or animals to become sick and show clinical symptoms. So make sure that you have the difference between epidemic and zoonotic disease. Make sure you understand that because those definitions do sound similar. And so the key here with epidemic is that it's so make sure that you kind of can distinguish between those two definitions because I know they do sound fairly similar. So then a pandemic is just an epidemic that affects a large number of people and occurs across the world. So be familiar with these general definitions. So again, zoonosis or zoonotic disease are infectious diseases that spread from animals to people directly through a bite or aerosol, or if the animal sneezes on you or something like that, or in food through a vector such as a mosquito. So again, just make sure that you know a little bit of the difference between zoonotic disease and then an epidemic. So we've talked about different zoonotic diseases. So we talked about the prion-based diseases, so basically mad cow, and then other types. So mad cow is caused by a prion, which is the infectious agent that's made of protein. And how this works is that it causes abnormal folding of the native amyloid protein. So these prions are not necessarily a virus or bacteria or anything like that. This is actually a case where it's a protein. So protein P, prion P, kind of a good way to remember it. And so the way that they work, like I said, is by causing that abnormal folding. So when they come into contact, the prion is an abnormally folded protein. And when it comes into contact with others, it's going to also cause them to be abnormally folded. And that's what kind of causes this degenerative disease, like mad cow. So understand this slide and what prions are and what they do and kind of how they work. So then, of course, we talked about mad cow, and again, that it's caused by prions and this abnormal protein folding. We talked about different viral diseases, and the distemper can be a big one. Rabies we talked about a lot. I feel like everybody's fairly familiar with that. So we talked about a lot of different parasites and how parasites, you can have internal or external parasites, and that they're organisms that live close to the animal or in proximity and completely depend on the animal. And so there are a lot of different ways to prevent parasites. So parasites are a really big deal because they can be a problem and cause economic losses, especially from internal parasites. So you need good management practices. So one of the major management practices that we talked about is deworming. So deworming or worming or drenching is when an anthelmintic drug or dewormer is administered to a human or animal to rid them of parasitic worms or helminths, such as roundworm, flukes, and tapeworm. So that's a really, really good management practice that if you have animals, especially grazing animals, you need to be familiar with deworming and what that entails. And then, of course, you know, be aware that the type of dewormer you're using, how much you're using, how often you're giving it, really can depend on the farm. But overall, just be familiar with what deworming is and what it's used for. And we've talked about lots of different parasites, so I'm not going to get too detailed on that. We also talked about milk fever as a big one, and especially dairy cattle. So Mastitis and milk fever both occur in dairy cattle, but don't get those confused. So if you remember mastitis, like itis is that like inflammation, infection, kind of that on the end of a word. That's kind of what it means. So mastitis is the infection of the udder. So don't confuse that with milk fever because they both they do occur in dairy cattle. Milk fever it's not limited to dairy cattle either. Neither is mastitis. But milk fever is a metabolic disease. So it's not caused by a bacteria like mastitis is. It's not an infection. So it's a metabolic disease that occurs at the transition between late pregnancy and early lactation. And so it causes hypocalcemia or low calcium in the blood, low calcium in the blood. And so that's not going to be good for the cow. So a common way to treat that we talked about is the injection of calcium borogluconate, which is basically just a big dose of calcium just before or after calving to kind of prevent that. But so understand what milk fever is if you have cattle or ever around cattle, especially dairy cattle because they produce a lot of milk. It's something to be aware of, and it's something that can be prevented with just a simple dose of calcium right before. So be familiar with that and don't confuse it with mastitis. Any questions on that PowerPoint? All good. Okay. So we move on to the last one. So the last chapter that we talked about was chapter 21. So we talked a little bit more about animal health, therapeutics, immunology, and vaccine. So like I said, there's been a shift in thinking from treating clinical disease to disease prevention. So there are a lot of different steps to promote animal health. So biosecurity is a really important step that we spent quite a bit of time on explaining what that is and why it's important. So biosecurity is a series of measures that attempts to prevent pathogens from reaching a herd or a flock of animals. And so it's really, really important because a lot of diseases can be prevented just by having good biosecurity measures in place. So understand what biosecurity is and why it's important. So it involves assessing what your risks are and then developing policies and things in place to kind of make sure that your farm is secure. If you kind of secure, think about it like that, you want to make sure everything is secure and that nothing is getting through. And so basically it just prevents pathogens from reaching. And there are many different measures that you can take in biosecurity. So for immunology, we talked about the two different systems. So there's innate immunity and adaptive immunity. For the sake of this class, I'm not going to ask you really detailed immunology questions because I think that's a little too far for what you need to know. If you continue on in animal science, you'll take an animal anatomy and physiology class. If you go far enough, you may even take a specific immunology class. So for this class, just be aware that there are two types of immunity, innate versus adaptive, and that those have kind of different responses. So innate is non-specific and has no memory of the pathogen. So animals are kind of born with this innate immunity. And then adaptive immunity is very specific. And that can come from, that's why the colostrum is so important for newborn animals. And then that's something animals can develop over their lifetime. So just some general immunology terms that we talked about. So antibodies versus antigens and understanding the difference between those and what each of those means. So an antigen is just a molecule that's capable of inducing an immune response in the host. And so then antigens are targeted by antibodies. So make sure that you don't get antigen and antibody confused. So the antigens are what's causing the immune response, and then the antibodies are what are targeting the antigens to, as part of the immune response to kind of deal with that antigen. So the antibody, also known as immunoglobulin, but we'll pretty much call it an antibody, is the protein that's produced and used by the immune system to neutralize pathogens. And so then a pathogen is just anything that can produce disease, so bacteria, viruses, anything like that. So is everybody clear on the difference between antigens and antibodies? Good? Okay. Just kind of a general immunology type thing. If you're going to be learning about disease, you kind of need to know the difference. So know those definitions. So nutrition and genetics can also impact how animals fight diseases. This does other things that can impact how bad diseases are going to be. So then we talked about a lot of different approaches to combat disease. Hold on, I'm skipping around really quick to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to ask you about like the different immunoglobulins because I think that's too much. And so again, passive immunity is the maternal transfer of antibodies. So that's mainly through the colostrum. So that's probably maybe going to show up somewhere because we've talked about colostrum a lot, especially on your old exams. And so then vaccines are also available. So you have the antigen, which is the protein that's foreign to the body, so it's going to trigger an immune response. And then the adjuvant, which will kind of present that to the immune system. And so basically just know that vaccines are an option and that you can have a killed organism or live organism. But overall, just know that vaccines are an option to prevent certain diseases, but not all diseases because not everything has vaccine. And so I think that's all. Anybody have any questions on that one? That last one was really, really brief. So we didn't have too much in this section. Any questions? Anything? Can you say another question or Okay, well, that is all for today. So remember the assignment. If you haven't done it, go ahead and get that done. And then no class on Thursday because the exam is opening tomorrow for those online people. So I don't want to go ahead and do another lesson on Thursday. And so I really enjoyed teaching all of you. Next Tuesday for the final. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
See ya.
Okay. See you, Doc.